The painting is entitled First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln. It is painted by a man named Francis Carpenter, and it's painted in 1864. When Lincoln announced his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, Francis Carpenter, who was a portrait artist, was utterly moved. He believed this to be a moment in American history second only to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And he wanted to capture it on canvas. And he finagled, he made connections, and he really wheedled his way into living in the White House for 6 months. Lincoln was happy to have him take up residence. And he reproduces his studio in the executive mansion, right? And Lincoln often goes to visit him. Carpenter believes that he wants to reproduce every detail of that moment when Lincoln announced this decision of emancipation. And so for that reason, he moves into the White House. He studies all aspects of that moment. He recreates every member of the cabinet that was there. He also recreates the details of that moment, particularly the resources they use. You can't see it here with the lighting, but there are atlases, anti-slavery newspapers, and maps, right? He wants to get everything right because he wants it to be realistic, nothing artificial, he says, okay? So he spends all his time studying that moment. And because he saw Lincoln repeatedly using the slave map, he reproduces it here in the corner, right? He saw slavery. He saw Lincoln time after time studying that map, right? And to the point where he actually wants to reproduce it in detail here. So what he does is to actually take the painting, or take the map back to his studio to reproduce it in detail. And one day, as Carpenter tells the story, he wrote a memoir about his time in the White House. One day, Lincoln comes into the studio to relieve the pressures of the war. And he immediately comes and picks up the map and says, "Ah, you have taken my map. I've been looking everywhere for it." And according to Carpenter, he takes the map, he goes over to the window, he puts on his glasses, and he starts to study the latest maneuvers of the military. In this case, the failed raid on Richmond, which was in 1864. I tell you this story because it gives us a piece of evidence. It's just a fragment, right, that I found. But it indicates that even Lincoln found something useful in this map. Like I said a few minutes ago, it showed him something that no other map showed him. And it allowed him to think about the war as a way to destroy the Confederacy's greatest asset, right? We talked about this in the first few weeks of this class. Slavery is the Confederacy's greatest investment, its greatest source of labor, but also its greatest source of capital, right? It takes Lincoln a while to get there because, of course, in the inaugural address, he swears he will never touch slavery where it exists. Well, after a year and a half of warfare, he changes his mind, right? And that seems to me, I don't have evidence that this actually changed his mind, but I do believe that a map like this showed him resources in the South in a way that he couldn't see otherwise, right? And it allowed him to think about emancipation as not just a moral measure, but also a military measure.